"I can wake your son," whispered the young nurse to the single-dad CEO. What happened next was miracle. "I said I do not want any more updates unless something actually changes." Matthew Carter's voice cracked like dry wood as it echoed down the empty hospital corridor. His dark blue suit, now wrinkled and stained with too many sleepless nights, clung to his frame as if bearing the weight of his sorrow. The hallway lights flickered, casting long shadows against the sterile white walls of the pediatric ICU. It was nearly midnight, but time had long lost its meaning for him. His 4-year-old son, Paul, lay motionless in the hospital bed, his tiny chest rising and falling with the aid of machines. 3 months ago, a drunk driver had taken the life of Matthew's wife and left Paul in a coma. Since then, Matthew, once the commanding and collected CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech firm, had become a fixture in room 214, silent, hollow-eyed, and slowly unraveling. Tonight, like every other night, he sat beside Paul's bed with his head bowed, clutching the small stuffed dinosaur his son loved. His eyes were red, not from crying, he had long passed that phase, but from exhaustion and the quiet ache of helplessness. Footsteps echoed softly behind him. "Mr. Carter?" A gentle voice pierced the quiet. He did not turn. "I said no more updates," he murmured, his voice like gravel. "I am not here to give you an update," the voice replied, steadier now. A hand, warm and confident, touched his shoulder. "I believe I can wake your son." Matthew's head snapped up. He turned to see a young woman standing beside him. Her hospital ID read Sandra Miller, RN. Her golden blonde hair was tied back neatly, though a few curls had slipped loose around her face. She could not have been more than 26. Her eyes, sea glass green, held neither arrogance nor pity, only conviction. "What did you say?" he asked, almost a whisper. "I said I believe I can wake your son," Sandra repeated, her voice calm and unwavering. Matthew blinked. "With all due respect, Nurse Miller, I have spoken to every neurologist in this building. They told me Paul's brain activity is minimal. They told me to prepare to make a decision. What exactly do you think you can do that they cannot?" Sandra lowered herself to his level, her expression serious but soft. "I know how that sounds. I am not here to give you false hope. I am working on a therapeutic method, an emotional engagement protocol. It involves consistent emotional stimulation, guided memory cues and sensory triggers, things that reach beyond the clinical to touch something deeper." He stared at her, silent, his jaw clenched. "You want to talk to my son. He has not moved a muscle in 3 months." "I am not just going to talk," Sandra said. "I am going to communicate. There is a difference." Matthew leaned back, shaking his head. "I do not need another miracle theory. I need facts. I helped a little girl, Ava. She was in a coma for 6 weeks after a seizure," Sandra continued. "Everyone gave up. I did not. I tried this with her. She woke up. The doctors could not explain it, but her parents saw it. They knew what worked. Her recovery is still ongoing, but she opened her eyes. She said her first word a week later." Matthew looked down at Paul. The boy's face was pale and peaceful, untouched by the chaos his small body had endured. "That was 6 weeks. Paul has been like this for 12. I know. That makes it harder, but not impossible." He sighed deeply. "Do you have approval from the hospital?" "I have clearance to do non-invasive therapy. I am not suggesting anything harmful. I will sit with him, talk to him, stimulate his senses gently. Music, familiar scents, even recorded voices, your voice, if you let me." Matthew hesitated. For a moment the CEO in him rose, demanding control, logic, reason. But then he looked at Paul again, the boy who used to laugh at frogs in their backyard, who called pancakes circle clouds, who had not felt his father's arms in months. "What do you want from me?" Matthew asked quietly. "Just your permission." "A week. Let me try for 1 week." He studied her, the way she stood firm, the calm in her tone, the shimmer of quiet fire behind her eyes. She was not selling him hope. She believed it. She believed in his son. Against all reason, something stirred inside him, a spark, barely there, but real. "You get 1 week," he said finally, "and if I see even the slightest sign you are making things worse, it ends." Sandra nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I will not let you down." He watched as she turned to Paul, her hand gently brushing a lock of hair from the boy's forehead. She leaned in close and whispered something only Paul could hear. And for the first time in weeks, Matthew stayed to listen. Sandra began Paul's treatment with a method she had developed herself, emotive memory immersion, or EMI for short. It was born out of her own experience caring for her mother during a coma and her deep research into how emotional memory can stimulate brain recovery. Each day, she dedicated 6 uninterrupted hours to being with Paul, not just to be present, but to actively awaken the dormant memories tucked deep within his subconscious, using a multi-sensory system that engaged all the gateways to memory. Sandra didn't simply sit by Paul's bedside, she built him a world. Each day she played carefully chosen sounds from his past. His father's voice reading bedtime stories, the bubbling noise of pancakes on a Sunday morning, and the soft lullabies his mother once sang. These weren't random recordings. They were fragments of a life Paul had once known, arranged in a rhythm that matched the days he used to live. She filled the room with familiar scents too, the sweet warmth of vanilla orange baby shampoo, the buttery comfort of pancakes, even the smell of wet earth after rain. She found ways to recreate them through oils and diffusers, layering the air with memory. From old home videos, Sandra learned how Paul's mother used to stroke his hair, pat his back in slow rhythms, hold him just so when he was tired. Sandra repeated those gestures exactly, gentle, careful, as if her hands could whisper to his skin what words could not. Even the light was part of the therapy. She used a color system to match each moment of the day, amber for motherly stories, soft blue for tales of outdoor play, lavender when it was time to sleep. The room shifted with emotion, like a storybook Paul could feel around him. And every day followed a script, a made-up routine that mirrored the life Paul once had. Sandra would greet him like his mom used to, tell him it was time for lunch with Dad on the balcony, walk him through an imaginary trip to the park, holding a pretend leash for his toy dinosaur. At night, she'd bathe him in words, dress him in memory, and lay him down with the same old dinosaur book, finishing with a song she barely remembered learning. At the end of each session, she'd place one hand over Paul's heart, the other over her own, and breathe slowly, in and out, together. She called it heart sync. No machines, no monitors, just a human rhythm, shared. A quiet conversation between souls. She wasn't just reminding Paul of life, she was inviting him back to it. Every day Matthew stood behind the glass, watching. He was a man who had once bent industries with a single decision. Now he was helpless. No amount of money could buy his son's voice. And yet, here was this young nurse, this blonde, gentle presence, doing something no doctor had dared promise. His skepticism turned into silent reverence. He began bringing her coffee in the mornings, then sandwiches, then a soft throw blanket when he realized she stayed well into the night. He never said the words, but his gestures spoke louder. "I see you. I believe in you." One night, as Sandra sang to Paul under the soft orange glow of the memory lights, Matthew watched, with a clenched jaw and a heavy chest. The glow reminded him of the hospital room the night his wife died, her half-open eyes, the final glance toward their son. He had held her hand and whispered, "You don't have to worry about him. I will take care of our boy." That promise had become both his anchor and his burden. Then, on the 12th night of treatment, it happened. Sandra had just finished telling Paul a bedtime story about a rocket ship going to the moon. She leaned down to brush his hair and noticed something unusual. A tear. It slid silently from the corner of Paul's left eye, leaving a glistening trail down his cheek. She froze. "Paul?" she whispered, her hand gently cupping his face. No change, no flinch, But the tear was real, warm and human. She rushed from the room, her voice trembling. "Matthew, come now, Paul!" Matthew ran in, breath caught. He followed her gaze and saw it, the unmistakable trail of moisture on his son's cheek. "My God," he whispered, collapsing to his knees beside the bed. "Do you think—" "He felt the story?" Sandra asked, voice breaking. "I don't know," Matthew replied, voice hoarse. He reached for Paul's hand, gripping it tightly. "But I think he's trying to come back to us." From that night on, Matthew never left the room again. The next few days were not easy. Word of the tear incident spread quickly through the ward. Some staff members found it touching. Others, however, were less kind. Sandra began to feel the subtle shift in energy, the way conversations paused when she entered a room, the sideways glances, the dismissive whispers barely masked behind coffee cups. "She thinks she can wake him with fairy tales," one nurse muttered in the break room. "She is sweet, but it is all in her head." "It is dangerous," another added. "The father is desperate. She is giving him false hope." Sandra heard every word, though no one said it to her face. Still, she continued her routine with Paul, unwavering. But the weight of isolation pressed a little heavier on her shoulders each day. Matthew noticed. He walked in on one such conversation while passing by the nurses' station. When the two nurses turned to see him standing silently, they paled. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone cold and controlled. "No, Mr. Carter," one of them stammered. "Then perhaps you could use your energy on something more useful than ridiculing someone who's doing more for my son than any of you have in 3 months." The silence that followed was complete. Later that day, Sandra found a single white rose left on her workstation. A note was tucked beneath it, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "Do not let the noise drown out what only your heart can hear. M." From then on, a quiet understanding formed between them. They began to speak outside of Paul's room. Sometimes it was just passing comments about the weather or the hospital coffee. Other times, it was more, deeper. One evening, as they sat near the window overlooking the city lights, Sandra shared a piece of her own past. "My mother had a stroke when I was 20, she said, her voice soft. "The doctors told me she would never wake up, but I refused to believe that. I moved back home, took care of her every day, read to her, sang to her, even when it felt like I was talking to the wind." Matthew watched her face closely, noting how her expression carried both pain and pride. "And?" he asked. 2 years later," she said, her eyes lighting up faintly. "She opened her eyes. She remembered my name." He was quiet for a long time. Then, almost in a whisper, "That is why you believe in Paul." Sandra nodded. "It is not blind hope, it is memory and love." The following night, Matthew went looking for Sandra after her shift. He had brought a book Paul used to love, one about trains, and wanted to see if she would read it to him, but she was not at the desk, nor in the break room. Something tugged at him, a quiet concern. Then he remembered the chapel. The hospital chapel was always dim, hushed, its stained glass windows glowing softly in the moonlight. He stepped inside, careful not to make a sound. There in the last pew sat Sandra. Her head was bowed, her hands clasped. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks. She was completely alone. Matthew stood there for a moment, torn. Then, gently, he slipped off his coat and walked to the pew behind her. Without a word, he laid the coat over her shoulders. He tucked a small folded note into her hand and left quietly. When Sandra opened the note minutes later, her breath caught. "You're not alone in this, Matthew." She held it to her chest and wept, not from loneliness this time, but from something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Belonging. The first time it happened, it was so subtle that Sandra almost missed it. She was adjusting Paul's blanket, humming the same lullaby she always ended with, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," when she noticed a twitch in his left hand, not a spasm, a deliberate tiny flex of the fingers. She froze, heart pounding. "Paul?" she whispered, kneeling beside him. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered. just slightly, like the soft brush of wings. Sandra ran to get Matthew. When he rushed in, breathless and wide-eyed, she pointed to Paul's hand. "Look, there." His fingers moved. "I saw it." Matthew leaned in, his eyes scanning every inch of his son's face, and then he saw it too, the faintest flicker beneath the lids. Paul's eyes didn't open, but there was movement, response, presence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Matthew exhaled, the sound halfway between a gasp and a sob. "He's in there," he said, barely believing it. "He's really in there." They called in the medical team. The doctors ran tests, measured vitals, checked brain responses. The results were inconclusive, but for Sandra and Matthew, it was a miracle already. They did not celebrate. Not yet. But their eyes began to hold something they had both been too afraid to carry. Cautious hope. 2 days later, Matthew approached Sandra after her shift. "I was thinking," he began, rubbing the back of his neck like a teenager, unsure of his words. "Maybe you and I could get dinner, somewhere outside this building, just to breathe." Sandra hesitated, then she smiled, her eyes gentle. "As friends, as two people who share something important," he said. "And maybe, who need to remember what normal feels like, even for one night." That Friday evening, Sandra appeared outside the hospital entrance, her blonde hair softly curled, wearing a simple navy blue dress that brushed just above her knees. It was elegant and understated, but to Matthew, she looked radiant. He stood in silence for a second too long. "You're staring," she said with a shy laugh. "I know," he replied honestly. "I was not prepared." They dined at a quiet Italian bistro tucked between two brownstones downtown. It was the kind of place where candles flickered and time seemed to slow. Their conversation was easy at first, light, even playful, but it did not take long before it turned deeper. "I used to think family was something you built after you made it," Matthew said, twirling his wineglass absently, "like a prize at the end of the marathon. Then everything happened, and I realized I had it backwards." Sandra nodded. "Family is not a reward. It's the reason." He looked at her, his eyes soft. "Do you think you'll ever have one of your own?" "I used to think maybe not," she said, a trace of sadness flickering across her face. "After everything with my mom, it felt selfish to want more. But now, I think maybe love is meant to be shared, not saved." Their eyes met across the table, and for a brief moment, the chaos of the hospital, the pain, the waiting, it all faded. It was just them, two souls finding light in the dark. Then Sandra's phone buzzed. She frowned. "It's the nurse's station. They know I'm off," she answered, her expression curious, then quickly changed to shock. "Wait, can you say that again?" Matthew leaned forward. "What is it?" She put the phone on speaker. A nurse's voice came through, breathless with excitement. "Sandra, Paul just spoke. One word." It was quiet, but clear. "What did he say?" Sandra asked, voice trembling. "Dad." "He said Dad." Matthew's fork clattered onto his plate. He stood, stunned. "He said my name?" he whispered. Sandra nodded, eyes wide and glistening, and said your name. The two stood in silence, their hearts racing with a joy neither had dared to imagine. In that candlelit restaurant, between glasses of wine and confessions of heartache, the impossible had begun to unfold. Paul had spoken, and for the first time in months, Matthew Carter smiled, not the smile of a CEO, but of a father whose world was slowly coming back to life. The room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the soft hum of the oxygen machine. Matthew sat by Paul's bedside, one hand wrapped around his son's, the other holding a small toy train Paul used to carry everywhere. Across the room, Sandra stood quietly, her heart pounding in quiet anticipation. It had been 2 days since Paul spoke his first word, Dad. Since then he had been quieter, his eyes still closed, his body still. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic. Words, they said, could be involuntary, a reflex, not necessarily conscious. But Sandra believed differently. So did Matthew. That morning, the air in the room felt different, lighter, brighter. Sandra leaned in, brushing a curl from Paul's forehead. "Paul, sweetheart," she whispered gently, "if you can hear me, it's okay to open your eyes. We're here. Your dad's here. I'm here." And then it happened. Slowly, with a delicate flutter like leaves in the breeze, Paul's eyelids parted. At first, just a sliver of light revealed beneath. Then, wider, his eyes opened fully, blinking against the soft light of the room. Matthew froze, breath caught in his throat. "Paul?" he whispered, unable to trust his voice. Paul turned his head slightly toward the sound. "Daddy?" he said, hoarse but clear. Matthew fell to his knees beside the bed, choking on a sob as he cradled Paul's hand in both of his. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here. I've got you." Paul's gaze slowly drifted past his father and landed on Sandra. His lips curved just slightly into the beginning of a smile. "Angel," he whispered. Sandra gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She could barely speak. Did he just? Matthew turned to her, his eyes already overflowing. "Belle called you his angel." Tears streamed down Sandra's face. She knelt beside Matthew, her hand brushing against Paul's. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice shaking. "You remembered me." Paul reached toward her, his small arm trembling, and wrapped it around her neck in the gentlest of hugs. And that was when the room changed. The door opened and two nurses stepped in, their casual postures vanishing the second they saw what was happening. One of them called for the doctor, who rushed in moments later, followed by more staff. Monitors were checked, pupils examined, vitals recorded, but none of them could explain what they were witnessing. "He shouldn't be this responsive so soon," one of the doctors said quietly to another. "His brain scans barely showed high perpendicular patterns last week." "Spontaneous neurological recovery," another guessed. But Matthew knew better. So did Sandra. This wasn't random. This wasn't science. This was love. This was patience, and storybooks, and lullabies sung into the dark. This was months of unwavering faith. This was a miracle born not of medicine alone, but of something far more powerful. Sandra remained kneeling beside the bed, one hand still resting lightly on Paul's shoulder. He had not let go of her. His small body leaned toward hers with the quiet trust of a child who had known her in the deepest part of his unconsciousness. Matthew, still beside them, pressed a kiss to his son's forehead. He looked up at Sandra, his voice raw with emotion. "You did this," he said. "You brought him back." "No," she whispered. "He came back because you never gave up." But Matthew shook his head. "No, I never would have made it this far without you." Paul let out a sleepy sigh, closing his eyes again, but this time not in coma, but in rest, in safety. The kind of rest only a child can have when they know, truly know, that they are surrounded by love. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by doctors, nurses, and machines that no longer mattered, a boy, a father, and a young nurse became something more than survivors. They became a family. The garden behind Matthew's townhouse was simple but beautiful, lined with soft string lights and surrounded by blooming hydrangeas and gentle lavender. The evening air carried a hint of spring warmth, and everything about the setting felt like a quiet celebration of life. Sandra stepped through the back gate, wearing a soft cream dress and holding a small wrapped gift in one hand. She had not expected anything extravagant, just a thank you dinner. But the moment she saw the table set under a canopy of golden lights and Paul seated happily with a paper crown on his head, her heart caught in her throat. Matthew smiled as he walked toward her. "You made it." "You said it would be a simple dinner," she replied with a teasing glance, her voice barely steady. "This looks like something out of a movie," he chuckled. "Let's just say I had a little help from a certain 4-year-old with very strong opinions about balloons and cupcakes." They ate on the patio, laughing softly as Paul devoured frosting with no shame. Music drifted gently in the background. Frank Sinatra, Billie Holiday, the kind of old songs that wrapped around you like a memory. After dessert, Matthew disappeared into the house briefly. When he returned, he was holding a square box wrapped in dark green paper. "This is for you," he said, offering it to Sandra. She looked up at him, surprised. "I didn't expect, just open it." Inside was a leather-bound photo album. On the front, embossed in gold, "For the angel who stayed." Sandra opened the cover, and her breath caught. Each page was filled with photos, small, candid moments from the last 3 months. There she was, holding Paul's hand during a lullaby, reading a storybook aloud, eyes animated, tucking a blanket under his chin with a tenderness that nearly leapt off the page. Every image captured a moment she thought no one had noticed. But someone had. "You were watching?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not in a weird way," Matthew said quickly. I did not want to forget what hope looked like, and I saw it in you, every day." Sandra flipped slowly through the pages, unable to speak. Each photo was a reminder of the hardest chapter in her life, and somehow also the most beautiful. At the last page, a handwritten note. "You didn't just wake my son. You woke something in me I thought I'd lost." She looked up, tears in her eyes. "Matthew?" He stepped closer, gently taking her hands in his. "I was angry at the world," he said softly. "Angry at God. Angry at myself. I thought love had been buried with my wife. I thought all I had left was work and silence and a boy I might never hold again." Sandra shook her head, her lips trembling. "You never gave up. I did," he admitted, his voice raw. "But you didn't. You came in and changed everything, with your stubborn hope, with your voice, with your heart." The lights around them flickered gently in the warm night breeze. Paul had fallen asleep in a hammock nearby, his toy dinosaur resting beside him like an old friend. Matthew brushed a strand of hair behind Sandra's ear, his hand lingering at her cheek. "Can I?" he asked quietly. She nodded. He leaned in, and under the soft glow of yellow string lights, he kissed her. It was not rushed. It was not dramatic. It was slow, sure, and filled with all the things they had never said out loud. When they pulled apart, she smiled through her tears. "Took you long enough?" Matthew laughed, pulling her into his arms. "You're not going anywhere, right?" "No," she whispered, resting her head against his chest. "I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." The garden looked different now, more alive, more radiant than it ever had before. Once a quiet private corner behind Matthew's home, it had been lovingly transformed over the past months. New blooms filled the flower beds, string lights hung delicately between trees, and soft music drifted through the late afternoon air. A year had passed, yet the memory of that long, painful winter, of hospital walls, sleepless nights, and the cold ache of uncertainty, felt like a fading shadow compared to the joy blooming around them today. Rows of white chairs lined the lush lawn, facing a small wooden arch wrapped in ivy and pale yellow roses, the same color Sandra wore in her hair the day Paul first spoke again. Beneath that arch stood Sandra herself, radiant in a flowing ivory gown that swayed gently with the breeze. Her golden hair shimmered in the golden hour light, and in her eyes danced a joy so pure it softened the heart of every guest present. Next to her, Matthew stood tall in a soft gray suit, one hand gently holding hers, the other lightly resting on the shoulder of their son. His gaze never left Sandra, not even for a second. It was the look of a man who had seen the world stripped down to its rawest truth and had found in it something unimaginably precious. Between them stood Paul, now 5, full of life and grinning from ear to ear. He clutched a small satin pillow, the 2 wedding rings tied in the center with a golden ribbon. Every step he had taken that day, every word he had spoken, felt like a testament to everything they had survived together. The ceremony was intimate and heartfelt. Their vows were not poetic performances, but quiet promises spoken through tears and smiles, witnessed by friends, family, and those who had walked beside them through fire. And when the moment came, when the final "I do" was spoken, Soft cheers and warm applause filled the garden like sunlight breaking through clouds. But it was what came next that truly stole everyone's heart. Paul, his little chest puffed out with pride, turned to the crowd with all the seriousness a 5-year-old could muster. Clutching a bouquet of yellow daisies nearly as big as his head, he spun around dramatically and launched it over his shoulder. Laughter erupted as guests scrambled to catch it, some nearly toppling over their chairs. Matthew laughed, scooping his son up into his arms, while Sandra watched them both with tears in her eyes. In that moment, the three of them weren't just participants in a wedding. They were a living miracle. As twilight deepened and the guests mingled, the family stepped away to a quieter spot in the yard. Each of them held a balloon, one red, one white, one sky blue. The strings tangled slightly as Paul fidgeted with his. Sandra bent down, smoothing the boy's shirt. "Ready to send them?" Paul nodded solemnly. "Tell me again what they say." Matthew knelt beside them, his voice warm. "Mine says hope, Mommy's says love, and yours says miracle. Because that's what you are." Paul's eyes sparkled. "I'm a miracle," he whispered, gripping the string tightly. "Yes, you are," Sandra whispered back, kissing the top of his head. "On 3?" Matthew asked. Paul counted. 1, 2, 3. Together they let go. The balloons rose slowly into the dusky sky, climbing higher and higher until they became tiny specks among the first stars. Silence followed, but it was the kind of silence filled with awe, with peace, with something sacred. That night, after the guests had left and the laughter had faded into the walls, Sandra walked into the kitchen and found a new drawing taped to the refrigerator. It was a family portrait. The crayon lines were uneven, the colors bold and joyful. Matthew was drawn with broad arms and a wide smile. Sandra wore a bright yellow dress, her hair in long golden waves, and right in the middle stood Paul, holding both their hands, his face round and beaming. Above them, written in shaky but proud block letters, was a single word: home. Sandra stared at it for a long moment, her heart stretching with gratitude. They were not just survivors, they were a family. Narration, calm and reflective, came in Matthew's voice, woven over the soft image of evening settling over their home. "I thought I had everything," he began, his voice deep and steady. "I had built an empire, controlled markets, closed deals worth millions with a single phone call. But none of it mattered when I stood beside my son's hospital bed, praying for him to just squeeze my hand." The screen showed flickers of memory, Matthew pacing the hospital hallway, Sandra reading softly to Paul, the flicker of Paul's eyelids opening for the first time. "I thought strength was about never breaking, about staying composed no matter what. But the truth is, real strength is the courage to break, and still choose to keep loving." There was a long pause, then softer still he continued. "Sometimes it takes the kindness of a stranger to bring us back to life. Sometimes healing comes wrapped in the voice of someone who refuses to give up, someone who sings lullabies to silence, reads stories to shadows, and dares to believe in the impossible." The scene shifted to their living room, warm and softly lit. Sandra sat on the couch, her arms gently cradling Paul, who had fallen asleep in her lap, one small hand clutching his favorite dinosaur. Her head tilted slightly as she drifted off, her breathing slow, peaceful. Matthew entered quietly, wearing a t-shirt and flannel pajama pants. He paused in the doorway, smiling at the two people who had reshaped his world. He crossed the room slowly, careful not to wake them. Reaching for a knitted blanket draped over the armchair, he unfolded it gently and laid it across them. His hands lingered for a moment, fingers brushing Sandra's shoulder, then Paul's hair. He sat down nearby, resting his elbows on his knees, and watched them with eyes full of quiet gratitude. "Life doesn't come with guarantees," his voice continued in narration. "There will always be losses that knock the wind out of you, but sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll meet someone who reminds you how to breathe again." The last shot zoomed out slowly, the soft light glowing from their home, the peaceful night surrounding it. A single phrase appeared on the screen, written in Paul's unmistakable crayon handwriting. Love brought me back. And then the screen faded to black. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of the power of love, or simply made you believe in miracles again, please consider subscribing to Soul-Stirring Stories. Here, we celebrate the beauty of human resilience, compassion, and the quiet heroes who change lives one gentle act at a time. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that just might warm your soul or bring tears to your eyes. Because sometimes, all it takes is one story to heal a heart. Thank you for watching.